Um, Today I'm going to be giving bits and pieces of a presentation that I gave to the United States National Intelligence Council, a workshop that they put on regarding Global Trends 2030, which is a quadrennial report that they produce for the forthcoming president. So they're in the process right now of producing a report for whoever is elected President of the United States this coming November. Barry is an instrumental piece of that report, and I had the privilege to give a presentation on global trends last May at a workshop that they presented. So I'm going to be talking about 5 global transformations that are happening. I have limited time, but I'm just going to kind of touch on them. These are the background bits of information that kind of frame our analysis when we're thinking about transformations on the African continent. So we're going to move from the global trends, we're going to increasingly move to the African context, and along the way, we'll eventually end up at our new website, which we're really excited about, launching that with a specific focus on Africa and our vision for how Africa is developing over the next 50 years, 40 years. So the 5 transitions I'm going to be talking about are this massive improvement in human development that has generally taken place over the past 50 years and that we are forecasting to continue. In general terms, there are, of course, places where we see human development issues persisting. So human development, that first major transition is a deeper driver of the second major transition, which is a demographic transition, which is a shift to older populations, smaller families, longer lives. Some of you may be familiar with the Hans Rosling video online that demonstrates this. Older people, smaller families. That's where we're going to start the presentation. The demographic transition has both positive and negative consequences. It's certainly not a simple story to tell. And so I'm going to highlight some of the positive transitions and some of the negative. The third transition that I'm going to touch on very briefly is a transition in power in the international system. So we hear very much about how the rise of the East, the rise of China. And so I'll show what our model is arguing about that. At that point, I'm going to pass the baton to Barry, and he's going to give an introduction to the center, and he's going to give a brief introduction to how the model is structured and really why we're so unique as a model. We are the only long-term integrated tool that's available globally. That'll lead me into the model, and this is where I'll actually show you how the model works. Okay? And that's going to be the 4th transition, where I talk about a transition in energy. Movement away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy production. It's not an environmental choice we have to make, it's an energy necessity. It's a decision that we will need to face as a global community. And then the final transition, which is an environmental transition. Okay? So the final piece, I'll look at climate change and freshwater use. All of this done fairly quickly. I'm going to start, though, with our data and our partnership, the Pardee Center for International Futures Partnership, with Google. Google has a public data explorer, which is freely available. They have this beautiful software, and they've been so kind to upload our data into the system, and we're the only large forecasting model on this system. So this is all free. These are all things that you can do online. So to the first transition, human development leading to a demographic transition. This is a fairly well-known relationship. On the up and down axis, there is the average number of children that a woman has in her lifetime. So a country like Afghanistan, back in 1960, the average woman had almost 8 children. And on the bottom axis, life expectancy. So how long we would expect someone to live at birth. So 8 children and a life expectancy of about 30 years. So we'll play this. This is from 1960. This is historic data moving forward. There you see China, the massive increase in longevity in China. You see some countries bouncing backwards with lower life expectancy. That has to do with things like conflict. But generally, and fairly consistently, there's a shift towards the bottom right corner, right? Smaller families, longer lives. This is driven by increases in education, improvements in health, improvements in governance. I mean, there are a lot of really, really positive things that have taken place over the last 5 decades. But you can still see that there remains, sub-Saharan Africa remains a bit lagged behind in this. So we're interested in thinking about how this transition is going to continue. We forecast this. This is the exact same graph starting in 2005, but as a forecast for 183 different countries. So here you can see China, the large, right, bubble size is the size of the population. So there's China, this is of course India, right? Back here you have large countries like Nigeria, a bit further behind. So we forecast this transition moving forward. And we see a continued series of global convergences around smaller families and longer lives. This is driven largely by continued advances in human development, continued improvement in education. There's really a positive story. There's a lot of inertia in education. If you educate someone for 10 years, you can't take that 10 years away from them. They remain educated throughout their lives. And so education has a huge amount of inertia, a huge amount of potential. Reduction in communicable diseases. We've seen large reductions generally, and these are the deeper drivers of this transition. But it is largely a demographic transition, and that's what I'm going to begin to move towards next. So on the up and down axis, you have this human development measure, the average number of years of education for a person who's 25 years old. So at the top, you have countries, European countries, Germany, there's the US, there's Japan. So you have fairly highly educated populations, right? So that's the human development story. And again, this is a forecast moving forward. And Barry will talk a bit more about how we get to these numbers. Then, at this axis down here at the bottom, you have the youth bulge, which is the percentage of the population that's between the ages of 15 and 29. Why is that important? You have really large youth bulges. That is seen as a deeper driver of instability, domestic instability. So what I've done is I've highlighted some of the countries that experienced Arab Spring events in 2011, right? You can see generally, many of them have relatively higher levels of education across the board, but they also have pressure from the youth bulge. This isn't to say that this is the definitive model of instability, but there are two relationships and two global transitions that we're seeing taking place. So, we move this forward. Countries in general tend to see a demographic transition where youth bulges are being reduced. This has the potential to reduce the impact of instability on domestic governance. That said, 20, 30 years from now, you still have countries like Nigeria who have relatively increasingly higher levels of education and still have large youth bulges that are similar in size to the current ones experienced in Libya and Egypt. So this is a tool for thinking about these transitions and pressures and the kinds of questions that we need to ask when we're developing policy, any policy. So that's the demographic transition. It has some good bits to it, right? If the youth bulge is a driver of instability, moving forward, it's reducing generally. We're increasingly seeing more and more people have increased years of education. So that can be a positive transition. It's not a panacea, right? It's not, this demographic transition is not a universal positive thing for our ills. There are huge potential complications for this. One of these is aging populations. Japan, Germany, Italy out here with about 20% of their population older than 65. You can see the impact that this has on budgets and the potential for economic growth. These are the vanguards of aging populations at the moment. But let's look at how this transitions, okay, over the next 40 years. Watch how rapidly Japan ages. Over the next 10 years, its population is 30% older than 65, right? This is moving into territory that demographers refer to as no man's land. We have no idea what societies will look like when, Germany has 30% of its population older than 65, and Japan is moving close to a remarkable 40% of its population older than 65. What are the pressures that will be experienced for pension systems? What are the growth potentials for countries like that? We've never experienced that. That's a largely rich country problem, but it has huge implications for the African context. And if we're thinking about policy choices that we can make today, we need to think in this broader global context. This is also the up and down axis is the one I ignored. This is the third transition in relative material power. This is the one we hear about, the rise of China. Our model shows this. We see massive growth in China, and we see continued slower growth in the US, 2 to 3% GDP. So I'm going to play this. This is a measure of relative material power that considers things like the size of your economy, the size of your population, military spending, and technology. So it argues that the US in 2005 had about 23% of the world's power. It was clearly the hegemonic power. China had about 11% and India was down here. Now if we watch this transition unfold over time, you can see that China and the US hit parity in about 20 years, and then China ages really rapidly. Okay? And then you have this interesting situation 4 decades from now, where it's definitely a multipolar world. It's a very different context in which Africa will be making its decisions and having to take choices. I'm going to show the exact same graph except use groupings. So the bubble size is again population, and the up and down measure is for the relative material power, and the left and right measure is aging population. So you see Europe's the oldest, on average about 15% above 65. Africa's the youngest. Playing this across time, Asia continues to become the hub of material power in the world, over 50% with China and India and places like Japan and South Korea. Populations age quite considerably. Europe on average is over 30% older than 65. Again, demographic no man's land. But you'll see Africa, how young Africa is moving forward. That's part of the reason that we see Africa being such a dynamic place over the next 20, 30, and 40 years. Because this leads to a demographic dividend, which is the relative size of the working age population to the total. One of the major drivers of Chinese growth over the past couple decades. And the possibility of African growth is quite strong. So at this point, I'm going to turn this over to Barry, who's going to take us from this global trends on the public Google website, and he's going to bring it down to our institutional home and talk about what the model does, where we get these numbers. So, Barry.